Steve asked me to speak today on the genesis and I guess the kind of results of Victorian glass worlds. But what I'd like to do is to describe the unfinished problems that the book set up for me. And as far as possible, I've drawn my examples from material that is not in the book. So those of you who've read it won't be bored. Steve, I wonder if you could put the Mervyn Peake up. The book covered the glass culture, which is actually Benjamin's word, created by breath-blown glass, an era roughly from the 1830s to the end of the century, when most glass, and this is really important, when most glass, from the thousands of prefabricated panels for buildings such as the Crystal Palace to the smallest glass phial, were created by means of human breath alone. Mervyn Peake, and this is what you see, there's another picture too, drew a series of sketches of glass blowers at work. And he worked as a war artist in the Second World War in the Chance factory at Smethwick, the firm that actually first initiated breath-blown glass on an industrial scale in the 1830s, an absolutely massive experiment. The Chance blowers were making cathode tubes for the army, and by the 1940s, glass blowing was already an archaic craft. In fact, it is amazing that it survived so long as a factory process. The rivals of Chance, Pilkington, which eventually took them over, and it's probably the reason why, had their last glass blowers leave in 1926. So you can see just how archaic that practice is. So look at the distended cheeks of the blowers as they transfer the breath of their bodies to the distended glass, matter and body in straining mimetic relation to one another. Remember that every piece of glass made in this way has the residues of human breath congealed in it. The air of 1940s Birmingham and only the air of that moment in history sealed into those cathode tubes. Peake wrote a collection of poems, The Glass Blowers, published in 1950, and described the hoarded breath, the molten language that is glass unborn, a poetry of barbarous birth. And there is something barbarous about this transfer of the human body's residues into matter in this way. It's not a terribly good poem, but I'll quote another bit of it. Their cheeks are blown like gourds that sweat and flush with goblin hues. I have with me, actually, a piece of breath-blown glass. I don't know how easy it is for you to see the translucent striae and very uneven undulations created by breath, and the blocks of the flattener who followed the glass blower and who smoothed the glass. I cannot emphasize too much that in the period of breath-blown glass, this man-made artificial substance had a unique material and cultural existence. It created a distinctive historical era, in my view. And interestingly enough, it created very distinctive, if you can move on to the glass cutters, there's another glass blowing episode. Look at those immensely distended cheeks. Then the poster, Steve, yes. Oh, this is not very clear, but it created an amazing union culture. It's something that tends to be repressed about 19th century history, but all areas of glass workers had very strong unions, and they all had these posters, and each member tend to own one of these. There were large posters designating the kinds of task that the glass worker was up to. So, to get back to my first question, what did I fail to understand about glass culture? I think there were two things. First, though I recognized how elaborate and complex the aesthetics of the glass world were, creating hierarchies of crystal artifacts in interiors that organized social ritual, I really did miss something. Now, here's Walter Benjamin describing the minute differentiations and specialized functions of table glass, laying the table when he was a child. I think, Steve, you've probably got a series of pictures of glass He talks like this. He was allowed to lay the table. Pulling a handle which opened up the dining room table, revealing underneath a leaf, when put in place, that served to bridge the distance between the two halves of the table, so that all the guests could be accommodated. Then I had been given permission to help set the table. In doing so, not only was I honoured by having utensils like lobster forks and oyster knives pass through my hands, but even the familiar everyday utensils called into service, and we wouldn't call these that now. The long-stemmed green wine glasses, the fine-cut little glasses for port, the filigreed champagne glasses, the silver salt cellars shaped like little tubs, the heavy metal carafe stoppers in the form of gnomes or animals, all had a festive air about them. Finally, I was allowed to position on one of the many glasses at each place setting the card which announced where that particular guest was to sit. There are some more pictures of this is a glass chandelier. I don't know how clearly you can see it. And there's a whole set of glasses from contemporary pattern books. You can see how elaborate and differentiated those glasses are. Benjamin understood the immense comfort and protectiveness of these middle-class interiors with their ritualized possessions, paradoxically defended as they were by the proliferating apparatus of fragile, vitreous artifacts. He understood that in proportion as these glass defences excluded pain and danger, so these repressed dangers reappeared. The breath in glass rhymes with death. Here reigned a type of furniture that, having capriciously incorporated styles of ornament from different centuries, was thoroughly imbued with itself and its own duration. Poverty could have no place in these rooms, where death itself had none. There was no place in them to die, and so their occupants died in sanatoriums. This is around 1900, remember, while the furniture went directly to a dealer as soon as the estate was settled. In these rooms, death was not provided for. That is why they appeared so cosy by day and became the scene of bad dreams by night. Now, it's very interesting that Benjamin was revising Berlin Childhood in 1938, the very year of the state-sponsored fascist glass-breaking frenzy of Kristallnacht in November 9th to the 10th in Germany, a major assault on the Jews, which perhaps signalled the final end of 19th century glass culture. The very moon, a reflective surface, of course, was hacked to pieces, Paul Celan wrote. I think it's necessary to think of and explore the underlying threnody of glass culture, a function of its overt but fragile security. Benjamin writes of the panorama, in his case, spectacle created from moving pictures on glass screens, as suffused with the ache of departure. You go right back to Keats' magic casements opening on the foam of perilous seas and so on. Keats put, at the start of the century in the Nightingale Ode, the image of the diorama to use here, I think. This whole period's commitment to feeling, the feeling of loss to sentiment, something we're often embarrassed by, I think really needs much more investigation, and I think we've only just started to see how that might come about. My second failure is ongoing and much more problematical and harder to describe. And that was to arrive at a fully elaborated account of the glass world's act of mediation. And going along with this, to say why mediation was important, not just an abstract question. The glass world was founded on the glassblower's breath that mediated or transformed the molten sand that became a transparent artifact. The transformation of materials into things and of things that themselves became agents of transformation in the material and social world became a source of study, of course, and inquiry at this time. So from sand to glass, and from glass to the perceiver's experience as she looked through it. And this brings me directly to the manifold world of transparent and reflective things created by the glass world. This era was the first time that a many times mediated world and the consciousness of it came into prominence, a world that was worked on. It was an era primarily of self-consciousness about reflection, in fact, in two senses. Reflection as the virtual image, sensuously experienced but non-material, and reflection as thought. The reflection became a placeholder for the idea of transformation, of all that work on the world that created a complex interaction between the perceiver or maker and things perceived or made. The reflection came to seem both an image and an example of this process. Now, very briefly, I want to use, as it were, two poems or two poetic examples of different understandings of glass that, as it were, occur at either side of this era that I'm talking about, which I hope will show why the act of mediation is so important. At one end stands a poem like George Herbert's The Elixir. A man that looks on glass, on it may stay his eye, or, if he pleases, through it pass, and then the heaven espy. Herbert shows that the man that looks on glass does stay his eye because he sees his reflected eyes. I think that's what he's trying to say very compactly. But it's also possible, in Herbert's reading, for the body and the mind to pass miraculously in an unmediated way through the material glass. The topography of this long line determinedly cuts through the indented shorter lines as if to demonstrate this very possibility. So this is, if you like, an innocent reading of the way glass mediates. I'm not suggesting that its innocence is simple, but it's an innocent reading. Marion Moore, on the other hand, a modernist, in her An Egyptian Pooled Glass Bottle in the Shape of a Fish, I think she's got things slightly wrong. What she actually means was it was a blown and moulded artifact, an ancient method. She wants to do something quite modernist with glass in a poem which belongs to the 1920s, very short poem. Here we have thirst and patience from the first, and art, as in a wave held up for us to see in its essential perpendicularity. Not brittle, but intense. The spectrum, that spectacular and nimble animal, the fish, whose scales turn aside the sun's sword by their polish. For Moore, thirst, that is the need for more water, simple physical need, patience, and art, are fused with the matter of the glass artifact, since they are the components that have gone to the making of this ancient vitreous fish bottle. They're all anagram-like components of these words that are fused actually with the word perpendicularity. As in a translucent wave, arrested, held, the glass reveals its history momentarily. But by the second stanza, the glass is something much trickier. The vessel is a spectrum. The bulge of its slightly protruding scales act as prisms to deflect or refract the light into rainbow colours. A dash precedes the spectrum. And after the occurrence of the dash, plus spectrum, attention seems to be deflected from glass to nimble, living fish. And the words the spectrum act exactly as the spectrum does in science to redirect our attention to something else. The spectrum, if you remember, bends things and moves light. So we are directed to that spectacular and nimble animal, the living fish, whose living scales likewise evade being caught, captured and speared directly by the piercing sun, by deflecting and refracting light. So this is a poem about refraction, not reflection. And even though there are ways in which the fish and its glass replica are in identity, the fish somehow evades being wholly caught by its representation. It nimbly turns it aside or turns aside from it, leaving us with the rhyme word polish, which half catches the fish in its sound, but which semantically refers back to the polish of a glass surface and to the human artifact rather than to the living creature. So it's a very complex exercise in evasion. And so with those passages on either side of what I've called glass culture in mind, I go to a passage from Christina Rossetti from Time Flies, which I did use, in fact, in the book. I'll point out when I've used, so as not to cheat, passages. This is a marvellous account of blown glass. Such a contour, a curve, a petrified blossom bell, flexibility itself or motion, arrested. Inert glass, moulded from within, caught the semblance of such an alien grace. Christina Rossetti was also fascinated by flexibility itself or motion arrested, as I think Moore was. But in her understanding, the alien grace of the glass blower's breath moulds inert glass from within. It really catches something, unlike Moore. It's the enunciation she has in mind, which, of course, for her is life-giving and yet curiously violating, so that the vessel becomes a performative semblance of grace and the complexities of the enunciation. Similarly, in the following two passages, reflection transforms space. A relatively simple example first, and this again I did use in the book. This is the only other example that I've used from the book. This is from a work by John Claudius Loudon, who was the genius of glass buildings, and he also interested himself in domestic decoration. Silvered mirrors of polished plate glass in gilded frames cannot be too profusely employed in a drawing room. And where it can be contrived, they should be placed exactly opposite one another. He was very dogmatic about all this. They should be placed exactly opposite one another, by which means the reflection of everything that comes within their focus is endlessly reproduced. And when cut glass chandeliers are lighted at night, the scene becomes a fairy-like. And there was a mirror, which I sent, a mirror reflecting a chandelier, which is just dimly there, which gives the kind of one of the effects that Loudon was aiming for. More complexly, and there was an infinite understanding of the subtlety of what a reflection meant at this time. I think something that I've only just begun to realise subsequently to writing that book. Ruskin studies the subtle discrepancy between reflected objects imaged in water and their originals, and he refers to painted reflections in water, a totally different arrangement of them, the objects reflected, that we should get if we were looking at them from underneath, under different lights and in different positions. And what he's observing is that reflected objects are not just transferred in their immediacy into the reflection of in the water, but actually we see them from different angles. We see them actually from underneath. We see their undersides, which we don't see when we're looking directly at them. So I've talked in terms of transformation, but this is both too simple and too abstract a way of thinking about mediation. Reflection is a constant philosophical image for mind and world at this time, because it doubles experience and externalizes it and puts us in a position when we can change it and change relationships in it. I think this is what is crucial for me, that this particular era of glass culture really was interested in the way that the process of mediation releases the possibility not only for connection but for change, and it's a change that isn't just in the self; it's a change that is social as well. And I've given you a little bit of rather arcane bit of Hegel just to bear out what I'm saying. The thinking individual is therefore not dumb as regards his external action, because he's thereby at once reflected into himself and gives expression to this reflectedness into self. And what he's saying is of course, that the capacity we have to externalize ourselves enables thought. And when we can't do this, reflection can't take place. So, struggling with what still for me is just incredibly difficult to set up in its specificity. We can think of mediation as a necessary mode of being in the world. And I think it's important because I quoted the Moore poem to suggest that issues of mediation sort of don't stay with us in the 20th century. They're there in the 19th century, but they're not regarded as important. They're somehow evaded, as Moore's fish evades representation. But they are central, I think, to this period, and I think glass was a central structure for thinking about it. We can think of mediation as a necessary mode of being in the world, the living, sensuous world, the world of thought and the world of social relations. It's crucial because through it we can move from one position to another, from one relationship to another. Now, in the book itself, I used people I love talking about, Hegel and Marx, to think about mediation. But Marx and Hegel invoke thought and the material world, as it were, at the expense of each other. And I felt that when I went back and looked at it was all too abstract. Encountering contradiction, the split between consciousness and other, thought itself can resolve opposition. That's the Hegelian position. Alternatively, a material element, labour, enables the subject to work on the world. That's a simplification, of course, of both, but that's Marx. Not only do these accounts keep collapsing back into dualisms and inert categories, self, object, consciousness, material culture, but they also have an insufficiently vital or dynamic account of objects and what Appadurai calls the social life of things. So without knowing that Steve was going to say a lot about Bruno Latour, I turned to Latour to try and rethink what this mediation of things, and particularly of glass, could mean. And also to Hannah Arendt, who I think has some really important things to say about this in The Human Condition. I'm going to very briefly try and say what each of them have said, and then I'll look at a series of passages, beginning with the extremes of glass culture, spectacles, eyeglasses, glass buildings, and then a series of passages about reflection. But first of all, let's see what Arendt and Latour have to say. So what Arendt does is quite deliberately replace Marx's table. You remember the famous use of the table at the beginning of his account of commodity fetishism, a table with its legs in the air, upended by fetishism, which for Marx is simply a commodity subject to the vagaries of exchange value. But Arendt, in The Human Condition, takes from the world of things the examples of a table that acts not in this way, but as a third term in enabling or disabling human relations. To live together in the world means essentially that a world of things is between those who have it in common. It's absolutely essential for social experience to occur, to have a world of things in common and between us. That's what she's trying to say. As the table is located between those who sit around it, the world of things, like every in-between, relates and separates men at the same time. She's not optimistic about this. A world of things belong to a socially shared and socially made world held in common, and does not place objects and subjects in antagonistic opposition. That's always the trouble with thinking about things. It falls into a kind of, there's a human thing, there's a human experience, and there are objects, and they can be very inertly related. But Steve has shown, of course, many ways in which that needn't happen. But the world of things is not, for Arendt, it doesn't fall into this dualism. It's actually the means by which relationships are bridged. Things constitute an in-between that makes possible the essential coming together and separation that creates social exchange. From Arendt's phenomenological perspective, explicitly in opposition to Marx, humanly made things, whether they are manufactured objects, books, or even forms of thought, belong to what she describes as the human artifice. It's well worth going back to all this writing. It's very, very suggestive, I think, the human artifice that enables the process of co-creation, human beings require. And I'm taking that word as Svetlana Boyan has recently used it, co-creation. She admits that in mass society, this is increasingly difficult to achieve. It's harder now for the shared world between of things to relate and separate people, to create interaction. And above all, it's harder to create the multiple perspectives on things that she values as central to human commonality. So it isn't agreement, it's a whole series of multiple readings of things that actually hold us together. Multiple perspectives are essential because they create debates about the humanly made world held in common and thus can change it. Now, Latour doesn't much like phenomenology and his emphasis on touch. He's rather disparaging of it. He writes of the limp inertness of a hand held when that hand is unresponsive, and claims that the phenomenologists have kind of forgotten about that unpleasant experience. He's not optimistic about objects, but like Arendt, he thinks that things can be vital actants, participatory actants, as mediators, a world between, albeit discontinuous mediators of social experience. Some people credit him with the attribution of a mystical life to objects. But this is just, I think, not the case. I think that's just a misreading of what Latour is doing, although I don't think it's a misreading of the sentimentality of Jane Bennett, about whom Steve was incredibly kind, I thought. Although, just as a little interposition, people have always wondered about materiality. If you go back to the philosophy of Joseph Priestley in the late Enlightenment, one of his obsessions was with the way in which we could think of matter as not inert and as potentially sentient. And of course, this impacts into romantic poetry and so on. So it's not a new concern, but Priestley was extraordinarily rigorous in the way he thinks about matter. That's just a little interposition as a result of what I heard earlier this morning. Social connections, Latour argues, can't be explained by invoking power or tautologically social relations themselves, explaining the social by the social. It is objects, things, that actually activate social relationships by becoming not just value-free mediators of information like a black box on a plane. That's his one extreme of the thing that doesn't kind of do anything. But they are formative in a mutually changing triune pattern of things, people and relationships. And I'm quoting just a little bit of the same of Latour, a slightly different passage. At first, bringing objects back into the normal course of action should appear, he says, innocuous enough. After all, there is hardly any doubt that kettles boil. These are very cunningly chosen examples. Kettles boil water, knives cut meat, baskets hold provisions, hammers hit nails on the head. This, of course, does not mean that these participants determine the action, that baskets cause the fetching of provisions, or that hammers impose the hitting of the nail. So this isn't an anthropomorphic reading of things. So what do things do for Latour? When a basket holds something, we invoke its containing powers in the cause of our needs, to carry provisions perhaps. But the containing powers of the basket simultaneously call upon us to negotiate our needs, to incorporate them in what Arendt calls the world we have in common. For instance, by assessing what we can purchase, how much, where, and for whom. We give the basket agency in order to transact social relationships. So we sort of co-opt objects into an active relationship with us, in order to exist in the social world. He is not somehow attributing a kind of autonomous life. The agency that we give to objects is humanly created. It's part of a network. That's, I think, why he uses the word network of needs and assessments and relationships. We join them and with them in a circuit of social activity. As Elaine Scarry once put it, I think, really brilliantly, in The Body in Pain, she's talking about a chair, actually. We relieve non-human objects of their inanimate status by using them, by being with them. It's a typically eccentric, Scarry formulation, but I think it's a very good one. For Latour, this means that we escape tired terms such as commodification, reification, objectification, material culture. So he objects to the word material culture, and I think he's probably right. If you need another example, consider how a totally new form of group and of eye movement and bodily stance is created by people, and we've just had an example of it just here, clustered round a computer. That social grouping just wasn't possible before computers started to be commonly used. And so in a way we have co-opted the computer as an agent into our newfound social relations. Or again, not only the world activated by the computer, but the person texting on a mobile. You know instantly when somebody's going to doing that and so on. You know instantly what they're doing. And that stance, that poise, that gesture, I don't think is historically available to us before the last 20 years maybe. Maybe that's an exaggeration. So that's what I think Latour means about things. Certainly that's what I mean about it anyway. But I think it's a valid way of thinking about the way social movement and encounters are created. Just before moving on, I think this does, in a poetic way, consolidate what I've been saying. Here's Benjamin talking about coloured panes of glass in a garden shed. In our garden there was an abandoned ramshackle summer house. I loved it for its stained glass windows. Whenever I wandered about inside it, passing from one coloured pane to the next, I was transformed. I took on the colours of that landscape, that, now flaming, now dusty, that lay before me in the window. So I've now got a series of passages that I want to look at in a kind of contemplative way, wondering how Arendt, Latour, Scarry might read these passages in 19th century novels, and wondering how one could get away from the rather stale and commonplace paradigms of material culture, colonial readings, and so on, that we now seem to be rather in the grip of. I first of all taken a passage from Kim, and then a passage about a large. I thought I'd do a small and large object, and I'm talking about glasses in Kim and a hotel foyer in Henry James, first of all, and then I want to look at a series of accounts of reflections in novels. This is an encounter between a Western curator of a museum and a priest, a native priest, who are talking to one another about mutual interests. The curator says, "Now lend me thy spectacles." And the curator looked through them. They were heavily scratched. These are the lama's spectacles. But the power was almost exactly that of his own pair, which he slid into the lama's hand, saying, "Try these." A feather upon the face. The old man turned his head delightedly and wrinkled up his nose. "How scarcely do I feel them, how clearly do I see. They be bilaur, crystal, and will never scratch. May they help thee to thy river, for they are thine." That's this encounter about exchange of glasses, somewhat an equal exchange of glasses in Kim. Now, how do we think about this? We might inflect this as a one-sided power relationship, and this would be the commonest way of looking at this, which I think has limits, in which the Western curator of the Museum of Indian Art is forcing the subaltern priest to see through his Western eyes and through the dominating technology of superior optics. But the curator uses the Indian word, bilaur, for crystal, so that in a way the glasses have already got a new identity, and stresses that the glasses may help the lama to see, not to see in a totalizing way, but assist his sight. So if you go back to the kettle that boils, here are the glasses that are co-opted in order to create sight. The glasses have taken on agency, have become participatory in a network of exchange, co-opted into action between men. Effectively, each man sees with each other's eyes, or attempts to see. It's not a simple experience. The Lama recognizes the mediating power of the spectacles. He feels he scarcely feels them. He sees he clearly sees. I think that's a wonderful moment in this exchange. The exchange, of course, is uneven. The creator now owning the llama's spectacles, will see through its scratches, but he'll see something that, a world that has in some senses been mediated through scratches, as the lama's world has. And it's possible that this exchange changes each man's world through the object that they hold in common, as Arendt puts it. Now, for a larger scale situation, a building, and I must say, having typed this out, and by the way, there are 1 or 2 typos in your handouts, for which I apologise. I then began to wonder how to think about it. It's in the Golden Bowl, and it's a moment when Adam Verver is waiting to know whether Charlotte Stant will accept him as a husband. It all depends on a telegram, modern technology and communications from the prince, who finally does give his assent in a rather enigmatic way. So one of the things that's amazing about James is the way he is embroiled in modern technologies and communications. It's not superficial, it's right at the centre of his work. He looked about in his small despair. He crossed the hotel court, which, overarched and glazed, muffled against loud sounds and guarded against crude sights, heated, gilded, draped, almost carpeted, with exotic trees in tubs, exotic ladies in chairs, the general exotic accents and presence suspended, as with wings folded or feebly fluttering, in the superior, the supreme, the inexorably enveloping Parisian medium, resembled some critical apartment of large capacity, some dental, medical, surgical waiting room, a scene of mixed anxiety and desire, preparatory for gathered barbarians to the due amputation or extraction of excrescences and redundancies of barbarism. Quite a complicated sentence. Now, one reading of this passage is through the conservatories. Again, it would be the conventional reading, and one that I've made myself, I'm afraid. One reading of this passage is through the Glass Conservatory's flagrant importation of colonial flora and its status as forcing house rather than a place of nurture. The glazed roof of the foyer immediately suggests the conservatory culture. Quasi-conservatory, the exotic trees in tubs and the exotic ladies in chairs are almost exchangeable. Trees in chairs, ladies in tubs. They become kind of ornamental objects. But in what sense can a building take on agency, create or undermine the world we hold in common? How can a building become an in-between? Now, humanly made but non-human, yet part of the human artifice. That's the problem. The Hotel Glass here embodies the Civic Conservatory's sophisticated importation of Orientalism in the Winter Garden, now fused and really overcome by an enveloping cosmopolitan Parisian culture. So James is thoroughly aware of the fact that the exotic is a kind of postulate, which is then overcome by a sophisticated metropolitan imagination, and that's all there in this paragraph. It's a medium which is, as it were, being overpowered, which is only a fluttering presence. The conservatory's overprotected atmospherics, it's literally artificial atmosphere, muffled, guarded, heated, draped, almost carpeted, change Verver's mood. And this in turn changes the whole social meaning of the conservatory for him. The foyer becomes an actant in a mutually changing spatial and communal relationship. Intimating the public space of the exhibition hall and the Crystal Palace, the space becomes for Verber a space of transit, much more like stations that were generically related to glass structures than anything else. And the waiting room of the traveller mutates almost instantaneously into the anterooms of the expensive doctor, a prelude to amputation, to an assault on the body. In a wonderful move, those exotic ladies become barbarians, and it's a consonance between the exotic and the barbarian. Ready for mutilation and correction, ethnic tribes imported into the conservatory space, as indeed often happened in exhibitions. But also, James is thinking of Matthew Arnold's term, barbarian, for the aristocracy. And he's fusing both these things together. upper-class people whose excrescences will be surgically removed. And so the building becomes an agent in a wholly new social and uncomfortable social vision. I think also Verver's thinking about amputation. He's thinking about the amputation of his possible marriage plans and indeed castration. It's there underneath everything. So finally, I'll turn to 3 more passages and speak about them briefly. They're all passages which have to do with mirrors. And the question I'm asking here is really, how do you think of a mirror as an agent in some form of transaction? The first passage comes from Thackeray. It's when a spinster is left alone with her father to live out her life in a virtually deserted house after the Battle of Waterloo. The great glass over the mantelpiece, faced by the other great console glass at the opposite end of the room, and you think back again to Glauden here, increased and multiplied between them the brown Holland bag in which the chandelier hung, until you saw these brown Holland bags fading away in endless perspectives, and this apartment of Miss Osborne's seemed the centre of a system of drawing rooms. This, I think, is a passage that's about the way mediation goes wrong or fails. The mirror has actually taken over here. Miss Osborne, the spinster daughter, instead of being a kind of in-between between mirror and mirror, is actually edited out of the opposing mirror images that repeat to infinity the shrouded chandelier that displaces her, I think, and her sexuality. You think of the Holland bag as a kind of womb here. The triune constellation of observer, the mirrored image, and the mirror is caught in a system. The mirror, biblically, increases and multiplies images. It's taken over breeding as well. And Miss Osborne is kind of locked into this system of repetition and can't get out of it. Nothing here can change. I think this period of glass culture was as much concerned with things going wrong as with the successful achievements of mediated objects. And now I'm going to read, and I'm sorry that I've had to cut it because it's full of a kind of buoyancy. This is a piece of Dickens from Our Mutual Friend. It's another mirror passage. The great looking glass above the sideboard reflects the table and the company. It's a reflection of a dinner party right at the beginning of Our Mutual Friend. Reflects the new veneering crest. He's the person who's giving the dinner party, in gold and eke in silver, frosted and also thawed, a camel of all work. The Heralds' College found out a crusading ancestor for veneering who bore a camel on his shield, or might have done if he had thought of it. And a caravan of camels take charge of the fruits and flowers and candles and kneel down to be loaded with salt. And the mirror then goes through every single guest that is at this dinner table, reflects veneering, reflects Mrs. Veneering, reflects Podsnap. These are the bits I've had to cut, and I'm really sorry about that. It reflects, finally, the charming old lady Tippins on Veneering's right, with an immense, obtuse, drab, oblong face, like a face in a tablespoon, and kind of like almost a mirror reflecting reflections here, and a dyed long walk up the top of her head as a convenient public approach to the bunch of false hair behind. I don't know quite what a long walk is, actually. It's something to do with the central parting that was adopted at this particular period, but I'm not quite sure. Those who know something about the history of hair and hairdressing might be able to come to the rescue here. So the mirror here, insofar as it produces correlative images interchangeable with what it reflects, might be said to be a mutual friend here, and a friend insofar as it's committed to being an impartial observer of the Veneering dinner party. What it shows immediately is that the friends it reflects have never even met before. But it's not like Latour's black box, this mirror, not simply passing on information even simply exposing the group. Because through it, I think, perceptions of the party change. It is a looking glass, it's an active object. The table the guests are gathered round belongs to that in-between that for Arendt makes and breaks social relations. And as the mirror looks, reflects, almost meditates upon the scene, we are aware that Veneering and his crested heraldic shield, cover or mask come into a suspect relation because they're all about concealing something, all about holding, blocking something. The hidden work and labour, too, is blocked. That grounds the luxury that's displaced onto the camel parade, and which in that uncanny, surrealist Victorian disproportion creates beasts of burden, cast in silver, that carry organic and perishable produce. I mean, there's a lovely kind of disturbing juxtaposition here. The mirror image gradually exposes the solipsism of the guests, but it goes further. It questions the borderline between the human and the non-human, the very categories whose interaction, if we believe Latour, create social experience. It does this by exposing hair. Every single person is given minute attention. The hair of every single person given minute attention. These are the bits I'm afraid I cut out, but you'll have to take my word for it. The reflections attend to Veneering's dark wavy hair, to the scant hair of Mrs. Veneering, not so much light hair as she might have, to Podsnap's light-coloured wiry rings, like hairbrushes, on either side of his bald head, his wife's ostentatious headdress and golden offerings, the raven locks of a mature young lady. Everybody dreads that category. And a gentleman, also a mature young gentleman, with too much ginger in his whiskers. And of course, Lady Tippins, who is in fact constituted by a tip of artefacts, including false hair. Hair, of course, is one of the Darwinian objects of self-display through which sexual selection occurs, the profoundest social transaction. It is dyed or false, but that's not the whole story here. Human hair is both part of the self and not part of the self, alive and dead, human and non-human, being and thing, self and artifacts. Hair here calls attention to the way human social relationships are mediated by dead artifacts here and by images that take on a life of their own and displace sensuous reality. The mirror is declaring its part in virtualizing the interaction of self, world, and images. Last example. This is from an account of Gwendolen Harleth in Eliot's Daniel Deronda. And happening to be seated sideways before the long strip of mirror between her two windows, just repeat that, between her two windows, she turned to look at herself. Her beautiful lips curled into a more and more decided smile, till at last she took off her hat, leaned forward, and kissed the cold glass which had looked so warm. How could she believe in sorrow? Now, much could be said about Gwendolen Harleth here. It's not actually that she is like Narcissus, falling in love with her image. We can only ever kiss our reflected lips, of course, when we kiss a mirror. But she kisses a surface. She has fallen in love with the mirror itself, its cold glass. She has forced an artifact to become her lover. That's my last example. So, to conclude, I've tried to look at these passages and the extraordinary, I think, sophistication that they are written with, and the complexities of the way they see the mediation of reflections. I've tried to suggest that they played an absolutely major part in glass culture by being co-opted as non-human agents among other human agents in creating and decreating social encounters. I've tried to get nearer to this process than I did in the book when I talk much more abstractly, I think, about Hegel and Marx. Human and non-human take turns in becoming the in-between that change relations. Now, I've ignored the fact that all these fictional encounters are themselves linguistic artifacts, although I've been conscious of that, asking of the reader a further act of transformation as textual signifiers coalesce into meaning. I've treated these novels as, to some extent, historical records, which is kind of like against my principles, but it seems important to do that just at this point. But the force of their imagined reality is intense. The great glass, the great console glass, the great looking glass, cold glass, all these entities enter into living experience. So, thank you.